Musical Talk, the UK independent musical theatre podcast.
Hello, welcome to this week's very special episode of Musical Talk. My name is Nick Hutson. This week we're going to be doing an interview with the nation's favourite children's playwright, David Wood, about a musical you might not have heard of that he wrote the book for, called ABBACADABRA, arguably the first jukebox musical involving the songs of ABBA. It has some fascinating stories surrounding it. So Andrew Keating and I sat down with David and we started the interview by getting David to give us more background information on the piece.
Cameron McIntosh, who was putting it on at the Lyric Hammersmith, as you've just said, at one point he said, after we'd opened, to Don Black, who did most of the lyrics, and me, he said, if we do a few alterations, this show will be all around the world within 2 years. And I thought it was the meal ticket, but in fact it was never ever done again. And one of the reasons anyway, that Cameron said he didn't want to do it again was because he thought it was too Christmassy, too Christmas oriented. And I said to him, well, it's not, because the title isn't. I said, yes, the characters do in England suggest pantomime, because there's Cinderella, there's Pinocchio, there's Aladdin, there's the Beast from Beauty and the Beast. But I said, it's not Christmassy in a pantomime way, and you haven't got those names to get in the way title-wise. But anyway.
And the style wasn't really pantomime, was it?
No, not at all. No, it was... I mean, these days you'd probably call it a family musical. I don't think we looked upon it necessarily as a children's show at all. And it was around about that time, because Cameron and I had done 2 of my shows together, children's shows.
When are we talking here?
Well, the Allen and Pussycat Went to Sea, which first saw the light of day Swan Theatre, Worcester, 1969, and then I managed to get it on in London at the Genetic Cochrane, 1970, and Cameron would have become involved round about that time. I was in a television play, a small part, and also in it, in a small part, was Patricia Hodge, and I was invited by Veronica Flint Shipman, who, with her husband, owned the Phoenix Theatre. I'm not quite sure why this happened, but I was invited to the opening of the Noel Coward Bar. So I said to Hodge, as I called her, would you like to come? And so she said yes. So while we were there, this man in glasses came walking up to me, who I didn't know who he was. And he said, excuse me, you're David Wood, aren't you? So I said, yes. He said, oh, my name's Cameron McIntosh. He said, and I'm a producer. He said, I just want to say that your Allen Pussycat Went to Sea is the best children's show I've ever seen. He said, and when it's on in place, I always go and see it. So I said, thank you very much. So he said, if there is ever the chance for me to work with you on this, I would be honoured. And so it came to be that we did it, first of all, at Guildford, at the Yvonne Arnaud. But then we did it again on tour, and it was at the Nuffield, Southampton. So he had come into my life in that way. And later, after ABBACADABRA, came The Gingerbread Man, which he and I took into the Old Vic after its initial performances at Basildon Towngate. And we did that for years. The thing was that Cameron went to France to meet Alain Boublil to talk about Les Miserables. And Cameron had this desire to do Les Mis. I don't know whether he'd seen it in Paris when it had rather unsuccessfully been put on. I think it was hearing the music, so there must have been a demo that made him think it might work. But while they were having this meeting in Alain Boublil's office, he saw an album, an LP, up on the window ledge or whatever. This was ABBACADABRA, it said on it. Now, Boublil, of course, was a record producer at the time. He wasn't really into theatre very much, although I think Les Mis was conceived as a theatre show, the intention probably. But ABBACADABRA was a very strange project whereby there was a sort of story involving the various fairy tale characters, who, of course, in France are not connected with pantomime. That was an interesting thought, that the Cinderella was not the sort of one that we imagine, with buttons and all that. And it involved a computer game that children got into and helped the fairy tale characters in the computer game escape from the Wicked Witch, Caraboss. Now, I honestly can't remember, because the album, I don't know that I even ever heard the album. I don't know exactly what the storyline was. But Cameron was intrigued by it, mainly, I think, because the songs were by ABBA. And yet the lyrics, which were in French, were nothing to do with the actual songs that he knew, as everybody did. And Boublil had managed to do a deal, I suppose, with Bjorn and Benny, that these songs could be used with new lyrics within the context of an album with a story behind it for children, but not just for children. The fairy tale thing didn't mean it had to be only for children. Cameron must have listened to it, taken it home, and he rang me up and said, would I be interested to work on it, creating a musical from it, because it wasn't intended as a theatre show. And so I spent quite a lot of time, and I put down ideas and all the rest of it. And then I was told that I could write the lyrics as well, or at least have a go. And we were down in Cornwall, I remember, on holiday, and there was no phone in the house. So I had to keep on going out to these telephone boxes, and there'd be queues, but I had to get on because Cameron needed to know what was going on. And I wrote one lyric, which did actually end up in the show. Eventually, Cameron and I both thought that maybe someone else should come and have a go. And so Don Black came in, who became a dear friend, as he does to everybody. I mean, he was lovely. And at one point, Mike Batt had a go as well. He and I was sitting in Soho in Wardour Street, where he had this office, and looking up at the wall where Mike Batt had all these words. And these were apparently good words to put into songs. And we were trying to do it. Didn't work. It didn't come off. But he did do some very good arrangements for the recordings that were made, which were then commercially recorded and released. But Frida is actually on one of them. So by that time, I suppose Bjorn and Benny had spoken to the other two, and one of them said, well, would you like to be in this? I think it was the Beauty and the Beast song, which she sang with B.A. Robertson, who played the Beast in the show and who was well known at the time really as a singer-songwriter. So then the next thing was, no, I'll just tell you the next thing, how it got to be written, was that Alain Boublil came over and we were introduced. And with him, he had a man called Daniel Boublil, the same name. And so I immediately thought they were brothers. Well, it's not I don't think it's a particularly well-known name in France. But of course, it turned out not to be. He was nothing to do with Alain, except that they worked together. Cameron put us together in a hotel room for 2 days or something, and they nearly locked the door. And the idea was that we would carve out a storyline synopsis. And a table had been booked at the Caprice, I think it was, where Alain and the agent, Patricia McNaughton, would be, and Cameron and Daniel and myself. And during the meal, I had to go through the synopsis and tell them what had happened. It wasn't typed out or anything. And it was at the end of that they said, yes, okay, you go ahead, go off and do it. And not, I don't know whether it was that long after, but suddenly I was summoned to a meeting with Bjorn and Benny, who were coming over to Cameron's office. Cameron, I think, was in Museum Street, then above the, in Museum Street. And so we were all taken off to some posh restaurant also, or something like that. And I had a lovely conversation, actually, with Bjorn, because I had gone through this lyric that I'd written, and he pointed out that there were one or two syllables which were wrong. And I said, they didn't give me the score to look at. I said, I was just listening to the French words, and occasionally there's an extra sort of end of a word which suggests that there are two syllables instead of one. Anyway, he was quite nice. But what I hadn't realised, and I don't think everybody knows this, is the fact that the lyrics for all the ABBA songs were written in English, because Bjorn far preferred the breadth of the English language to Swedish. And he was talking very much from the English point of view, which was interesting. Gradually, this thing came together. I was allowed to choose which songs to use, which were not always the ones that had been on the album, and other people had the odd idea as well. And Don, as I say, came on board and started writing some lyrics, and the time went very, very quickly, I remember, until rehearsal, and off we went. And of course, it was a very prestigious cast.
This is one of the things which is absolutely insane about it. When you read through the cast list, I mean, let's start with the three children. So the three children who all went on to kind of great things, and they were...
Well, you had Jenna Russell, who was, I suppose, about 13 or 14, and she was terribly good. She was the leader of the three children in a funny sort of way, even though the boy was older and was played by Dexter Fletcher, who now is better known as a film director, isn't he, than as an actor. And the young one, he was 10 at the time, was Nigel Harman, who was terribly good. And
that must have been his first job, do you think?
Well, I think so. He was terribly accomplished, and one felt, confident. He didn't seem to be out of his depth at all. Looking back, it's quite interesting because I can't remember how many weeks it ran, but it was a Christmas season, so let's say 4 or 5.
It might have been big. I've read 8.
8? As long as that. Well, every seat was sold. It was quite frightening. There were actually fights at the box office. And there were a lot of people who came who you felt had never been in a theatre before in their lives, but they were ABBA fans. And I always remember going in one night and there were these people having a very serious discussion about what a circle was, because there was a sign up saying circle.
Or an interval.
Yes, that's right.
I think I was able to find out that the fan club, the official fan club in October, had advertised it in terms of people could write in before a certain date to get their tickets. You would have probably had quite a lot of fans in there, I think.
No, I think that's true. And the reception was wonderful. And quite a lot of the reviews were really very, very enthusiastic. And better, I may say, than Blondel, which had opened quite recently before with the same director, Peter James, and indeed transferred to the Old Vic for a while, whereas, of course, we didn't. There also in the cast, you had Elaine Page, who fairly fresh from Evita.
And just before Chess. So you've got that link. You've got a link between ABBA kind of informally wrapping up at the end of 82. The boys are spending much of 83 working on Chess. And there's Elaine
Dame Elaine.
Dame Elaine, as of now, filling that stopgap.
Well, that's right. And one can bring Tim Rice in to a certain extent as well, who Elaine was, of course, very friendly with round about this time. One of my favourite stories is that on the first night in the bar, I suppose, in the interval, I met Tim Rice, who I knew, and with him was a young woman who he introduced as his assistant. And we didn't say very much or anything, but years later I discovered that her name was Judy Kramer. And it always has struck me that it was that night that gave her the idea that maybe something to do with ABBA was a good idea. I have no idea. Another thing about her, which I hadn't quite realised, I couldn't have done because it hadn't quite happened yet, I don't think. But one of her first jobs in the theatre was as an ASM on My Gingerbread Man, which Cameron and I were doing at the Haymarket, Leicester. we were also doing it at the Old Vic. We had 2 productions, and the one in Leicester went on to tour on top of My Fair Lady. The set was built in such a way it could be bolted into the Fair Lady set. So Judy Kramer came into my life then as well. And the other, of course, that first night, I was sitting next to Andrew Lloyd Webber, whom I'd known since he was 17, I think, and I would have been 18 or 19. And he came up to Oxford, which is where I was, and he actually said that his aim in life was to change the face of the British musical. I mean, it's remarkable, but it was true. And this was when he asked me to be in the Dr. Bernardo musical that he and
The likes of
Tim Rice. Well, yes, it wasn't called that then.
Oh.
Yes, he. I'll come back to the other one in a moment, but he called me round to his rooms one day, and he had rooms because he had an open exhibition, open scholarship, I should say, to both Oxford and Cambridge at the age of 17 to read history. And he chose Oxford. And so as a scholar, he had these rather impressive rooms in Magdalen College. And he said to me one day, he said, my publishers have said, the 17-year-old, my publishers have said that this new musical that my friend Timothy and I have been working on, they're willing to give us some money in order to put on a student production at the Oxford Playhouse. He said, would you be interested in playing Dr. Bernardo? And I said, well, yeah. He said, well, come back to my rooms and I'll play you some of the songs. And he did. And they were some of the catchiest tunes I'd ever heard. And that was very nice. And we talked and talked until in the end it was past midnight, and they used to lock the colleges at midnight. And I realized I couldn't get out. So I had to climb over a wall, and he had to give me a leg up and push me over this wall to get home. Well, now, I had left by the time this actually happened, but it did happen, and another student did it. And soon after that, Andrew gave up his degree and went to the Royal College of Music, which was, where he...
The most successful dropout ever.
Yeah, well, absolutely. But going back to the first night of ABBACADABRA, Andrew was sitting next to me, and at the curtain call, in nice applause, he leant over and he whispered to me, "I think you've written another Joseph." And that really was rather nice to hear. I thought, oh, that's good. But again, it never ever happened again.
I think the show, for those who did see it, it does seem to be very fondly remembered. So again, we talked about Elaine, Dame Elaine. Now she recently had her big celebration concert at the Palladium, and they played in a video message from Sir Cameron. ABBACADABRA got a mention. It got a mention, so my ears pricked up at that. And he revealed it was also the stage debut of the infamous Page cackle.
Well, of course, she was a very good cackler, and
there's not much cackling in ABBA. Right?
Well, I wonder. You see, yes, it's interesting that whether she'd ever used that before, I don't know. I had, I think, once seen her when she was in Billy with Michael Crawford at Drury Lane. So I sort of knew her name from that. But whether or not she'd ever used that cackle, whether she'd ever been in pantomime, I don't know. I think it's true to say that she did strain her voice a little bit, because there were the occasional performances where I'm afraid she wasn't on. But of course they were doing it virtually twice daily because it was a Christmas show, and that was sort of expected. Well, yes, there was Elaine, and then you suddenly had people like Michael Praed, who...
just pre-Robin Hood, wasn't it? No.
Pre-Robin Hood, yes. He was, again, one had sort of heard his name, but not to a great extent. But he was playing Aladdin. Yes, he was very good Aladdin. And his girlfriend at the time was Finola Hughes, who had played the white cat in Cats, and who was gorgeous. I mean, she was very beautiful. But whether or not she only did it because Michael did it, or whether he only did it because she was offered it, I have no idea. But they both came and were really rather good.
And then they both go off to America and go into soap opera, don't they? So he goes into Dynasty as, is it Prince Michael of Moldavia? I'm trying to think of my soaps now.
Yeah.
Does she do General Hospital, something like that?
She did. I don't know whether it was General Hospital, but she was over there for years, doing well. And I think it's that interesting, isn't it? The chicken and egg. I don't know whether he was invited over there first or whether they both went over there to seek their fortunes. I honestly don't know. The other thing was that she wasn't really a singer, and her dancing was exquisite. But she did sing the Cinderella song, and I think she did it rather well. Then, of course, we had the fun of Sylvester McCoy. And, of course, memory plays tricks. I don't think he'd done Doctor Who by then.
He hadn't.
And he was doing mad theatre shows, Ken Campbell type shows, wasn't he? But he was a wonderful injection of humour as Pinocchio. And I remember thinking he did his song extremely well. And then there was Phil Daniels.
This is the insane thing. You have Phil Daniels, the great Phil Daniels coming on, and he's just going beep beep as a robot
With a great name.
With a great name. Actually, that's one of my favourite puns, which you'll have written. What was the robot's name?
I don't know. What was it?
He was the forest robot enemy detector, Fred.
Fred. Oh, yes, that's right. Yes, I think that was my idea. Yes, I think it was. He was terribly good. And the thing was, they all entered into the spirit of it because very often with a pantomime, say, or even a sort of family show, there is this attitude that you sort of put your tongue in your cheek and you send it up. You don't play it for real. And you often see it when there are pop stars, say, in a pantomime, because they're not really actors.
They shouldn't be there.
And probably they shouldn't be there. Although I always remember Cilla Black, who I was very fond of. I played her boyfriend in a sitcom once on television and was very pleasantly surprised, really.
Surprise.
And she was in Aladdin. She did it in several different places, and the director was always from television, one of her television directors. And she was wonderful. But she didn't want to sort of do the big emotional stuff. So when she was locked in the cave by Abanazar, she would do things like, "Oh, what can I do? What can I do?" And it was all sort of over tongue in cheek. And I always thought it was a bit of a shame because, as far as children are concerned, it's quite real, that moment. And she went up to the sort of stone-like door, or whatever it was, and pushed herself against it, saying, "Oh, whereupon this door opened slightly and was immediately shut again. So one knew that there was a stagehand behind it or whatever who was just holding on to it, and she had put her weight on it. Well, of course, she corpsed. The whole audience laughed. It was the biggest laugh of the whole show, the same sort of laugh as when an ugly sister's wig falls off. And 99% of the audience think it's the only time that it ever happened. But, of course, they did it in every show. And I always used to feel that it was a bit of a shame that the biggest laugh in the show came from a moment like that, which was a moment which sort of undermined what you were doing, and you were on a different sort of wavelength. But no, everyone in ABBACADABRA seemed to really take it quite seriously. And the fact that we had to get these fairy tale characters through to the end without being killed off by Caraboss and her henchmen, and of course Phil Daniels' robot was relaying messages and so on. No, looking back, I suppose it was quite of its time, really. I mean, because video games had only really just come in.
Because it was the whole idea they were playing a computer game, and they're then stepping into that computer game. It becomes real, kind of, I guess, a virtual reality idea ahead of the time, wasn't it?
Well, I think it was. And the other thing which I put in, which I suppose you could say is a bit of a cliche now, they were in their school, and their teacher, who was a bit of a witch, if you like, unpleasant teacher, she, of course, becomes Caraboss. So it's a bit Wizard of Oz, isn't it, really, where the characters at the beginning become the
Did it all really happen, and who's tidied everything up, and did it all,
Yeah, that's right. No, that was very me at the time. And when I did Prince Charles's book, The Old Man of Lochnagar, when I adapted that, I did a similar thing whereby was it all a dream, and something that he was given by the King of the Gorms underwater in another scene. He suddenly found that he had it, and
like the snowman as well, when he has the scarf at the end.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. I mean, it's a nice device because it sort of rounds it off and puts a line under it. The music I always thought was really terribly well played. Simon Webb, who was the musical director, he had done, completely by coincidence, he had MD'd one of my pantomimes at Hornchurch. I don't know who found him to do this, but he was good, and the arrangements were very good as well. All the musicians were in a room somewhere, God knows where they were, across the street probably, which was something that started happening in those days, whereby you could pipe it all in, and you could still have the MD on a television screen up at the front of the circle for them all.
Did it creatively get a bit muddy at times? Because I'm just looking at the programme. You got music by ABBA, written by Bjorn and Benny. Then you've got original story by the two Blue Blues. You've got the book by you, David. You've got lyrics by Don Black. You've got additional lyrics by Mike Batt and Bjorn and you. Kind of where did it kind of... Who came in to say, yes, you do this? And because it was songs that we all knew by ABBA, with rewritten lyrics. Is that correct?
Yes, because we were having this discussion about when is a jukebox musical a jukebox musical, and when is it not? You're using the melodies, not the arrangements, and not the lyrics. So is it a jukebox musical? Is it not?
I had never heard of this being done before. I mean, the idea of taking, translating lyrics, yes, that's a totally different thing. But this is using a song which seems to be appropriate for the moment in the show, and then creating lyrics which are particularly appropriate for that moment. It's no, I had never heard of it before. I was very, very surprised that it was possible even, and is this allowed, and the whole copyright situation. But they were all obviously very happy with it. And to be honest, it was at a time when I think their popularity had waned slightly, and we perhaps felt that they were a little bit past their peak, and maybe they saw this as a way to revive interest. I don't know, but having said that, they still had a huge fan base.
Yes, they did, and I think to some extent they'd obviously worked with Alain for a long period. I think he'd been their music publisher in France. Because that's the other thing. They're very protective of their music, of their work. And so the idea of actually letting somebody else take that on and do something with them or with it, if it hadn't been Alain, it probably wouldn't have happened. And you have to be able to give your work to someone who you think, okay, yeah, they're going to do a good job. I think he'd even written lyrics for them. I think he did the French Waterloo. I think before Les Mis, I believe he did, yes.
Yeah. Well, there was a little industry in writing lyrics for Eurovision songs. I even wrote, I don't know what year it was a long time ago it was. I wrote the lyric for the Dutch entry for the record that was made in advance, just in case they won. And the song was called Waterman. And my lyric sort of went, Waterman, born under Aquarius, my lucky star, that's what you are. And it was actually recorded. And meanwhile, they were beavering away with other European languages just in case, you know.
Yes.
And I don't think it was ever released. But no, I've still got the 45 record that it was on. But no, I think that you're absolutely right. I think that Bjorn and Benny must have trusted Alain, and because he'd obviously done good things as far as promoting them in France or whatever it may have been, and they let him go along with it, because they weren't really involved with the production at all. And since then, it has been done by other people. Other people have got their hands on it and done it in different ways. If you Wikipedia it, you learn things that certainly I didn't know anything about. But the sad thing was that it finished. And Don and I used to meet occasionally and bemoan the fact that nothing more was happening. And then other people occasionally got interested. I remember Edward Snape. Now, I'd known Edward since he was an usher at the Palladium, and he had come along to meet Bob West, who, as you probably know, was Cameron's company manager. But he suddenly said, I wonder about ABBACADABRA. I wonder if we might be able to look at it again. But it didn't come to anything. And even recently, only within the last year or two, Hugh Waldridge and I have spoken about it because he had heard about it, whether or not he saw it. I think he was around at the time. I mean, I got to know when he was the assistant director on Jeeves. And I was asked to play Bingo Little in the original Jeeves at Her Majesty's. And the fascinating thing was that Andrew, of course, was in at rehearsal. I mean, that's a whole story, and I've written about that in a book. But on one particular day, Andrew said to me in the rehearsal room, he said, oh, that song, he said, it doesn't really work. He said, I think what I'm going to do is to get that song. You remember that song in that Dr. Bernardo musical, the one I played you today? He said, I'm going to get Alan Ayckbourn to write a lyric to that. And that became Travel Hopefully, which was da, 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 da. And that had been something totally different. And of course, as you know, Andrew never wastes anything and will recycle things if necessary.
So, talking of recycling, you had a new song in ABBACADABRA, I Am the Seeker, which I think they'd been working on that since about 1981 for ABBA, didn't get anywhere. They'd worked on it then in early 83. How does it get to you?
That's interesting, isn't it? I don't know. They must have suggested it, I suppose. Yes, that was The Beast sang that, didn't he? Da 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 da. But am I right in thinking there was not a lyric to that?
I believe
before?
That's right. Yes,
because it doesn't sound immediately like the Beast's song, but it became it. I mean, he was the lonely beast or whatever. No, I honestly can't remember how that happened. No, that's an interesting one because it certainly wasn't an ABBA hit that everybody knew about. And it came quite early in the show because some of them were, I mean, the Dancing Queen was a big number. That was the one, wasn't it, that Elaine sang?
Yes, Carabo's Super Show, I think. And
yes, yeah. Now, even all these years later, if I hear a song, sometimes I will actually have the ABBACADABRA lyric in my head and then think, no, hang on, it's not that, is it?
Do you think Les Mis got in the way of ABBACADABRA?
Oh, that's interesting.
Or did ABBACADABRA create Les Mis? I'm thinking,
I would like to think that Alain Boublil was quite pleased with ABBACADABRA, and because it did, it made quite a little stir or whatever, and that may have helped the relationship with Cameron. I mean, Cameron, being Cameron, was really determined to get this thing on. And I mean, as you know, when it didn't get great reviews at the Barbican, he was so determined, and a lot of people, I think, would have felt, oh, I've fallen at the first hurdle and would have sort of given up. But he committed a tremendous amount of money and all the rest of it to it transferring to the Palace. And he's always had this great belief in the public making the decisions rather than the critics. And I think it was true that even with the reviews it had at the Barbican, nevertheless, there were people queuing round the block, as it were. And I always admired him hugely for holding his nerve. But of course, he'd always done that. I mean, with Cats, Cats was on a knife edge before it opened. And I mean, yes, it got reviews and so on. But I remember I used to go into the office round about that time because we would have been doing Gingerbread Man, and there was a lot of concern, a lot of.
Well, the cast invested in it, didn't they? They had to.
Yeah.
And Judi Dench broke her leg and things.
Yeah.
And...
it was all going on. But no, your point about Les Mis getting in the way of ABBACADABRA. I mean, it could well be that Cameron not took his eye off the ball, but you see, the thing was, after it came off, Cameron was still interested, and he said, we must think about this. And he was a bit uncertain about Peter James's direction. I think this was partly because he was disappointed with Blondel. And certainly there was a feeling, I remember him thinking, have I made the right decision here to let Peter James direct ABBACADABRA? But Peter did a perfectly, serviceable job, and he was very in tune, I think, with the material. And we had Anthony Van Last, I think, doing the choreography.
That went on to do Mamma Mia.
Who went on to do Mamma Mia. And I think there was a certain amount of confidence in the people, but he wasn't quite sure whether Peter James would be able to pull it off. I think Peter James very, very nearly did pull it off. In fact, I think was very nearly there, really. There were, and the audiences went mad. I mean, but we always thought, is that because of ABBA? You see, is that because of the songs and not necessarily the show? But Cameron then said, we need another director and we need another person to think about this. And I remember that he brought in Michael Bogdanov. And Michael Bogdanov, I knew again because he had contributed some sketches to a review that I had been in and co-produced on tour, and we'd done it on television as well. And he, nice man, mad Irishman, who had worked at the Young Vic. He'd done things at the National, the sort of family type shows. Bodger, he was always called. And he'd worked at the Haymarket Leicester, the Phoenix Leicester, I think, even before that, doing TIE type shows. And so it was a reasonable assumption to make. So Bodger came and we had a chat, and it became apparent to me that he was wanting to change it in a way that I didn't accept. I mean, he said, oh, the children, it's got to be grittier. It's going to be, they've got to swear and all that. It's all far too gentle, you see. And I said, no, I really didn't think that. And I told Cameron that I felt that it wasn't the right thing to do. But I think round about that time, the doubts set in. And then, as I said earlier, this thing about it being seasonal. I mean, suddenly Cameron was saying, this is a seasonal show. It's not going to work all the year round. And I couldn't really understand why he said that, unless it was simply an excuse just to pull out and not, because Alain was very keen. And I mean, I remember when Don and I were trying to get interest from people to maybe take, this is some years later, Alain was perfectly happy to let us have a go, in spite of the fact that I think by then they'd done it in another couple of countries in different ways.
They'd done it, I know they did the TV version in France, and then I think there's a Dutch TV version and a Portuguese. They seem to swap the characters out. The Dutch, for some reason, had Red Riding Hood and the Wolf.
It's interesting. Well, of course, we had Beauty and the Beast, or the Beast and Beauty. And in fact, the ending was really to do with them they were all going to the wedding of Beauty and the Beast, which was a clever idea. No, I can't remember whether that was from the record or whether that was my idea, or I honestly don't know. But I remember thinking that a quest was a good way, particularly in a show like this, of where are we going, and there are these various hurdles put in the way, and the crows, for instance, who try to stop them going through, and they were played by some remarkably agile and effective dancers, who one of whom, Stuart, I met only a couple of years ago. He was teaching in a drama come dance school, and he had happy memories of the show. Yes, they had to play these sort of almost like American gangster type crows. I don't know quite where we got that idea from.
I'm just impressed by the children from Chiswick Comp, which is the local school to me, which I think is what yes.
Yes, well, they would have been in the first and the last scene. In other words, when they were in the schoolroom, and then they come back to the schoolroom, and we come back, and Elaine sort of softens a bit as the teacher.
Do you think there's room, this is for you as well, Andrew, for a one-off, I mean, they're very popular, these kind of one-off charity concerts and things. Do you think it's something that would be allowed? Do you think there's a market for it? Would it something you'd be interested in? It's obviously still prevalent in people's minds.
I think it's an interesting thought. Whether or not the idea is a little bit old-fashioned now, because the way these games and everything have developed, it's but at the same time, I mean, the idea of going into a computer and
maybe a mobile phone now.
Yes, exactly.
With AI, I mean, there are ways you could look at it to make it be more.
Yeah.
But then again, it could be a period piece of the 80s, where this kind of technology was just at its beginning.
Yeah. No, I think so. And we'd have the three children played by the same three people coming back. That would be fun.
But ABBA, I mean, you said to me that without Mamma Mia, ABBA wouldn't be as big as they are now. So they are, in a way, more. You've got ABBA Voyage, you've got Mamma Mia, you've got the Mamma Mia films.
That's why this show is of interest to me, because it falls in that period where, in fairness, by the end of 1983, yes, they were old hat. They were forgotten about, and the boys weren't that involved because they probably weren't that interested. The girls were off doing their own thing. Obviously, yes, you had Frida's involvement. If you're getting to play a princess, why not? Why wouldn't you be involved? The boys are doing chess, and it's not till the 90s that they have that great big revival. In fact, one of the reviews we saw of the time is very sniffy about the music, going, oh, they've picked all the worst bits of ABBA. They've taken all the banal melodies and gotten rid of all the good bits, the wonderful harmonies, which seems a bit harsh. It's not something you wouldn't hear that now. There was a kind of... So you've got that 90s revival, and then Mamma Mia kind of comes in. There's a whole generation that know the music.
I think it is very interesting. I went to see ABBA Voyage. I mean, technically, it is extraordinary. I think the sound is extraordinary. The lighting is extraordinary. They seem to be in their holograms a little bit far away, but nevertheless, there were things in it that amazed me. Like one moment you saw a band at the side of the stage and singers and all the rest of it, and the next moment you looked up and they'd gone completely, and you thought, well, where are they gone? And the fact that the theatre had been built specially for it, and the fact that they're probably going to build one in Australia, that they're probably going to build one in America. I mean, you've got that thing where you go and eat and whatever that's called.
Near the party.
Yeah, the party. I mean, it is extraordinary, isn't it? And the fact that it opened again on Broadway, albeit for a limited season. And
chess. Then they've just revived chess on Broadway.
Yeah.
If you think about Mamma Mia, there are, if you take the songs, they're obviously in 3 different shows in London every night at the same time. It's bizarre. You've got...
When you're saying about ever doing ABBACADABRA again, my initial thought would have been, that they would never want the songs to be used. But actually, there's a Muriel's Wedding musical where they did give them the rights to use some of the songs. And in fact, you've got characters playing this kind of dream version of ABBA that she'd give bad advice. So a bit like the Bad News Bears in Avenue Q. But they do some amazing things with the songs. And I have no idea how they managed to get that permission. Maybe it's about 4 or 5 ABBA songs in there. But the fact you could potentially have that show running at the same time as everything else.
I would think it's because they've obviously seen what jukebox musicals can do. And it's easy, dare I say, it's easy for money for them. They don't have to do anything. They just say, yes, we trust you. Their reputations are going to get damaged because they're pretty solid as they are at the moment, I would think. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Steve?
Well, see, when I do remember when we started, I was given 3 or 4 albums, LPs, so I could listen to everything. And I remember finding the song which eventually became Pinocchio's song, and asking, can we use that? Because it wasn't on the original record.
Piper.
The Piper. That's right. Yes, the Piper. You see, your knowledge is better than my memory. But it was a nice sort of perky song. Now, one of the things that I did always think was that there were a few songs in there, bearing in mind that ABBA were not writing musicals. They weren't writing songs for musicals. They were writing pop songs, some of them, brilliant, but using the form of a pop song. And I remember thinking that the Beasts song, the Seeker song, and also as the Cinderella song, both of which come quite early in the show, both of which are quite slow ballads. They're not the up-tempo songs that perhaps we best remember from ABBA. And I remember thinking, these are not really musical theatre songs. They don't really go anywhere. You don't really know much more by the end of them. You haven't necessarily progressed in the plot. And they do, in a way, they don't lift off, and they seem a bit pedestrian. And to a certain extent, I think that's probably still true. I think if one listens to tracks that we managed to find eventually, when I say tracks, I mean a recording of a live performance, I think, you want to get on with the story. But when you get into the up-tempo numbers, they seem to work. They seem to work better. I mean, this Mamma Mia thing I do find fascinating. Did Judy Kramer know much about ABBA? Because at the time they weren't particularly well loved. I mean, they'd been discarded a little bit. And yet, as we said before, they did have a huge fan base still who were slightly older. They weren't the immediate pop teenage, early 20s generation. They were older, which was, of course, from the theatre-going point of view, rather a good thing, because they were the ones who were more likely to want to come to the theatre than maybe the younger one. But one does wonder whether Judy had this in her mind all that time before things started happening for her and Mamma Mia, or whether or not that was a complete coincidence. I just don't know.
And I always find people poo-poo on jukebox musicals, saying there's no skill to them. I said, well, of course there is. It's just the opposite, as opposed to putting new songs to a story. You're putting a new story to existing songs. It's kind of moulding it from the other way round. And I think there's massive skill in Mamma Mia. What I remember seeing Mamma Mia 100 million years ago was that the audience would laugh every time a song would start, because they know the material. So there was a kind of, oh, that's how they're fitting that in. That's very clever. And then the story happens outside the songs. You're certainly a pioneer, I think, David, without even realising it, I think.
Yes, I certainly never thought about it like that. I probably was looking at it more as a children's stroke family show than they were. And what that means is that I'm looking for clarity in storytelling so that audience understands what's going on. And very often people sort of don't worry too much about that. To me, it's very important. And I was asked not that long ago, someone said, what's the difference between a children's show and a family show? And my answer to that was very simple, really, that a children's show is the type of show that you would go to with children, and that's the point of going to see it. Whereas a family show is a show that adults would quite happily go to without children. You've got that balance whereby, yes, children can appreciate it. And those types of shows were, at the time we're talking about, really rather rare. Yes, you had it with pantomime, I suppose, and some pantomimes at the time had virtually no story at all. You could write the story on the back of a matchbox. And that used to annoy me because the children were just treated to speciality acts and people singing pop songs, and you'd go to the Palladium, and which I always enjoyed doing because I'd always go on the first performance and things would go wrong. But you'd have Engelbert Humperdinck doing most of the second half, doing his whole repertoire, or indeed Cliff Richard and the Shadows. I remember seeing them in pantomime. So it was a glorified variety show, but it had always been so. So that never really worried me. And the children would very often, there was enough in there for them, even though they did often turn off at the love ballad. That was when you'd see the cues for the loo. From my point of view, what I was always trying to do was to think of the children and not the adults. My attitude was, if the adults are watching their own children engrossed in something and enjoying it, then they, the adults, are going to be happy and they will enjoy it. Maybe they'll enjoy it in other ways. But the children are the main thing. And Cameron and I had this rather serious discussion when, I suppose it was round about the time I was starting off Whirligig, my touring children's theatre company, which was in 1979. And Cameron and I had done by then Rock Nativity. We'd done The Owl and the Pussycat Went to Sea, and we'd done The Gingerbread Man. And he said words to the effect that he respected what I was trying to do, but he believed that the future, commercially, was going to be in family musicals, Joseph being the classic example, Oliver being another example. And at the time, he was desperate to do Mary Poppins, which, of course, he eventually did. And when I look back now, the irony to me is the number of family shows which have been based on children's books, children's classics, and films as well. I mean, Shrek, Frozen, for instance. But Paddington now, I mean, the huge thing that's going on about Paddington is fascinating. There's a sort of nostalgic thing. I know that the film and all the rest of it. But Matilda was another one. And my 8 Roald Dahl adaptations that I did, which were not musicals, but were plays sometimes with songs, sometimes with music, which I like to think were faithful to the original and so on. They were not family musicals. They were, as near as damn it, they were family shows in the sense that we were able to do 7 o'clock performances, which some of my other children's shows you couldn't do. And we did have the overlap, undoubtedly. I mean, when we did The Witches the first time at the Duke of York's, I remember, the huge area of the circle, one performance, was taken up by young women in their late 20s, maybe early 30s, and they'd all come on a works outing because they were
charity meeting.
Books. Yes, that's right. Yes, they could have gone on stage as the Witches, but they came because they remembered the book with such affection. But I couldn't have written Matilda as Minchin and Dennis did. That I couldn't have done that, and I wouldn't have wanted to. But I respect what they did, and I went to see it, and I respected it hugely. However, for me, it wasn't Dahl, and it actually wasn't really for children. But who am I? I mean, and it's obviously worked and been hugely successful, and I don't resent that at all. And I had my 25, 30 years of Dahl, which I was very, very fortunate to have. But now, of course, the whole thing has become almost a Disney machine, and they've got their own company. developing the shows and so on. It's all a bit different. But I think that ABBACADABRA, it almost fell between stools, because suddenly I was in a world working with Don Black, for instance, but we've worked on about 4 things together which haven't happened. But we've always loved working together. There was a version of The Selfish Giant, the Oscar Wilde, that we were doing for an animation, I think it was. That was interesting because we did a lot of work on it, actually, and it was the main person in the company that was meant to be doing it was Ruth, Sheridan Morley's wife or widow, but it didn't happen. So no, I'm very, very fond of Don, and I wish that we could have had something that could have actually been successful. But I suppose looking back in a way, ABBACADABRA was successful.
But there's one creative we haven't mentioned. Well, it's 50 years since the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Was Sue Blaine. Sue Blaine was your costume designer. There's not much of a visual record left of the show. There's pictures in the brochure of her costumes.
No, you're probably right, because you see, in those days, I don't think people videoed productions, even for the archive. There are so many things now that I look back on and think, it'd be nice to see what that looked like. On the other hand, they probably look terrible. You probably say, oh my God, that's awful. It's like the very first children's show I wrote for Swan Theatre Worcester in 1967. Which was the Tinderbox, and they didn't film it, but they did put a Grundig under the stage, and they got a reel-to-reel recording of it, and I was all very pleased. And of course, they sent it to me, and I listened to the first half and hated it so much that I've never ever listened to the second half. So I think it might be the same sort of feeling if things were filmed, but it would be interesting, and certainly the design of the show. Was it Jenny Tiramani actually did the set design, but Sue Blaine certainly did the costumes, and they were very futuristic. I mean, they were fascinating, and the way it was lit. I remember, see, Andrew Bridge, I think, lit it. Yeah, well, Andrew Bridge, of course, did Phantom, didn't he? And he was the son of Peter Bridge, who was the impresario who put on lavish revivals of Noel Coward and Oscar Wilde and period costume revival with Michael Dennison and Dulcie Gray and people like that. And Andrew, he was a very nice man. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know whether he's still around. He's still credited with the lighting design of Phantom, I think. But he did a tremendous job. And I think visually, it was, I don't know about ahead of its time. That's probably an exaggeration, but it was really rather exciting, put it that way, and the sound was as well. And when the robot came on and everything, all these noises that were being made, I was really very pleased, because of course with my children's shows, the most we ever had was one keyboard player.
I remember seeing the BFG at the Polka Theatre, and or the Witches, I can't remember, as one of them, and there was a guy on the keyboard, the stage right or something. Oh, I want that job. That looks fun.
The musical directors over the years with Whirligig, my company, we gave opportunities to, we were delighted to have them, but they were very often quite new to the business. Paul Knight, who is around, does quite a lot. Chris Nightingale, he started off with us. He's Matilda, of course, still now. Simon Lee, who became Andrew's music supervisor or whatever, he was the pianist on Old Man of Lochnagar. The music was an integral part of my shows, which is why it was rather exciting when there was actually a band, particularly with incidental music as well. And Peter Ponson, who was my, I suppose you call him, musical supervisor for 50 plus years, who was quite remarkable. He did all the arrangements for virtually everything I wrote. And he did the music as well for a couple of my productions. And he sadly died just after Christmas. It was Boxing Day, I think. this year, and I miss him hugely. And the last thing he did for me was, well, there were two things. He did Tiger Who Came to Tea, and he remained, even when he was very ill. He used to be the MD on Zoom, and we had one in the room occasionally as well, but he taught everybody. And then when I did Floella Benjamin's Coming to England, which was 2 or 3 years ago, which we've done twice now. We did it at Birmingham Rep, and then there was another production, and it is hoped might tour again next year. But Peter did all the arrangements for that. But I think going back to ABBACADABRA, the show was on, in a way, a slightly larger scale than I was used to, which was exciting. But I think that if I made it, the contribution I made, I like to think, is the actual storyline told clearly in such a way that any age group, as it were, could relate to it. And I like to think that it did show off the songs, even though some of them, as I say, were probably not musical theatre songs quite enough. But with the presence of Elaine and other people.
So musical theatre singers can elevate songs from the basic pop level to the kind of more story-driven beats, can't they?
Who made the decision to put the singles out? Because that's quite unusual, isn't it? So kind of like, well, we're having a short run show. Let's put 2 singles out. Let's see what happens. That's pretty.
I think that Mike Batt might have had something to do with that. Now, whether Cameron spoke to him about it or whether he spoke to Cameron about it, I honestly don't know. It was quite a surprise to me. And, you know, when I was, I don't know, when I was still at school, maybe even quite young, I always remember you'd listen to the radio in bed, you were ill, and the morning programmes. And there was music while you work, and there was the organist entertainers. There were all these programs. And what happened with something like My Fair Lady was that before it opened, you got to know all the songs. And it wasn't just because they were recorded, although some of them were. And so Victor Moan sang On the Street Where You Live, and it was top of the charts in this country for weeks. And so by the time the show arrived, people sort of knew the score.
Go in humming the tunes.
Yes. And I always thought that was a clever thing to do, because none of us necessarily hear a hit song the very first time we hear it. And I think that Cameron, you see, he would have been influenced to a certain extent by Superstar, just the knowledge of how Superstar started off as a record. And indeed, Evita, I think, wasn't that originally a record at the beginning? The concept album, or whatever they would call it. Joseph was slightly different. I mean, that became an album, but he wrote it for that school, Collett Court, Alan Doggett or whatever, who was the music master who asked him to do it. And it was a 30-minute version, wasn't it? And then it grew and grew and grew.
Keeps growing now.
8 days long now, I think, with all the mega mixes at the end.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it goes on and on and on. But no, I think the idea of music becoming popular, however that could be controlled, and as I say, radio took a big part in that, because musicals in those days were not pop, and yet the songs were light music. They were the sort of things you might hear on the Light programme, which became Radio 2 or whatever. And for me, see, Salad Days was a revelation when I first saw that. Now that's, if you listen to that now, it's all very twee. But,
to end this conversation, tell us about the book.
Well, that one is called Elizabeth Taylor's Kiss and Other Brushes with Hollywood. And it came from people saying that I really ought to write about my Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton experience, which was when I was at Oxford. And they came to be in a production of Dr. Faustus in order to reward Neville Coghill, who had been Burton's tutor when he was there briefly before having to go into the RAF in the war. And it was the most extraordinary experience, where royalty, really, were living among us, and we had to rehearse in the police station gym and all that. Anyway, the whole story is there. And on the after, there was a recording made for audio, and Elizabeth decided that she would come, even though she wasn't on it. She played Helen of Troy, but didn't have to speak. And so we were there, and at midnight, as midnight struck, I realised it was my 22nd birthday, and she kissed me on the lips and said, "Happy birthday, darling," and whatever. And so that gave the title of the book.
Thank you so much, David, for coming on to Musical Talk once again. It's always a joy to have you on. Thank you also to Andrew for helping us with that discussion. Thank you for listening, and we'll speak to you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Musical Talk. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk, you can visit our website at musicaltalk.co.uk, where you'll find all our episodes, or you can listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. Please follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Musical Talk.